Washington, D.C. was suffocating under the weight of its own division. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that the country was teetering on the edge of something irreversible. January 20, 2025, Donald J. Trump's second inauguration, had drawn an audience unlike any other. Some had come to celebrate. Others had come to bear witness. But all understood the gravity of the moment. The National Mall stretched endlessly, packed with red-capped supporters cheering as the former and now once again president prepared to take his oath. Across the sea of bodies, a contrasting presence stood in rigid formation, rows of military personnel in crisp dress uniforms, their faces unreadable, their purpose unwavering. Among them was Jack Reynolds, a 27-year-old Army Ranger, standing at attention with his unit. Jack had served in Afghanistan. He had seen chaos before. But the unease he felt today was something different. It wasn't the enemy that troubled him, it was the feeling that history was shifting beneath his feet. The ceremony began. Chief Justice Roberts, with carefully measured solemnity, raised the Bible. Trump, standing tall, placed his hand upon it, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The crowd hushed. The moment had arrived. And then, it happened. Elon Musk, billionaire, visionary, disruptor, a man too powerful to be ignored, raised his right arm and extended it outward in a slow, deliberate Nazi salute. The cameras caught it. The gesture was neither accidental nor careless. It was purposeful. A provocation. A test. At first, there was hesitation. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd, some shifting uncomfortably while others exchanged knowing glances. A few, too many, laughed. Some clapped, uncertain at first, but then louder, bolder, as though emboldened by each other. Others simply looked away. Jack did not. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his training kept him still. His grandfather had fought the Nazis in World War II. His father had battled insurgents in Iraq. He had grown up hearing their stories, warnings whispered in tired voices about what happens when good men hesitate. This was no joke. Jack's jaw tightened. His grip on his rifle remained steady, but his knuckles whitened. The war was supposed to be over. The ideology his grandfather had bled to destroy was not supposed to be here, standing before him at the highest seat of American power, mocking the very oath that had kept the Republic alive. And yet, here it was. Jack moved before his mind could catch up. He stepped forward, his boots striking hard against the marble of the platform. He could feel eyes on him now. His commanding officer stiffened beside him but said nothing. His voice was clear, strong, a single command ringing through the still, fragile moment. "Stand down, sir." The words hung in the air, sharp as steel. And the world held its breath. The world saw it. It began as a ripple, a moment caught on camera, almost too surreal to believe. A soldier, one man in uniform, stepping forward against one of the most powerful figures in the world. The footage spread like wildfire, first through live streams, then across social media, looping endlessly on every news network. Elon Musk's smirk was unmistakable, his eyes locked onto the young soldier in front of him. His expression held neither surprise nor fear, only amusement, as though testing the limits of what he could get away with. Jack Reynolds, rigid with discipline, stood his ground. The stark contrast between them was impossible to ignore. One was a billionaire who had never worn a uniform, who spoke of conquering Mars but had never fought for an inch of land on Earth. The other was a soldier, bound by oath, standing against something his country had sworn to destroy. The moment crystallized into something greater than itself. The image of Jack standing firm while Musk's arm remained extended became a symbol overnight. It was not just about that moment, it was about a battle between two visions of America. And then, the backlash began. The reaction in Washington was immediate. As Jack was pulled away from the platform, his commanding officer's grip was tight, his voice low and urgent. There was no room for questions, no hesitation. The chain of command demanded discipline, and an active duty soldier speaking out, especially in that moment, was something the military had never dealt with before. But Jack did not regret it. Inside the secure perimeter, away from cameras and microphones, he faced his superiors. Questions came fast, layered with disbelief and frustration. What the hell was he thinking? Did he realize what he had done? His response was unwavering. He was not thinking about his career. He was thinking about the oath he had taken. The uniform on his back was not just a symbol, it was a responsibility. Meanwhile, the Pentagon was already in crisis mode. Behind closed doors, military officials scrambled. This was no small scandal. A Nazi salute at a U.S. presidential inauguration, captured on film, witnessed by millions, and a soldier calling it out in real time. The implications were too massive to ignore. Senior military officials huddled in urgent meetings, weighing the gravity of the situation. It was not just about optics. It was about history, about precedent, about what it meant if they let this pass without response. This was not some fringe event. This was the inauguration of the President of the United States. And standing right there, in front of the Capitol, under the full gaze of the world, one of the richest men on earth had tested the limits of what could be normalized. Jack Reynolds had stopped it in its tracks. The White House, however, had no such urgency. For hours, the press clamored for a statement from the administration. Reporters flooded the briefing room, demanding a response. Would Trump condemn Musk? Would there be consequences? But there was only silence. No reprimand. No condemnation. No attempt to explain, justify, or distance the president from the act. Instead, something far more telling happened. Elon Musk was invited to a private meeting at the White House. The news sent shockwaves through the country. The silence from the administration was no longer just inaction, it was an endorsement, a signal to those watching that this was acceptable. If there had been any doubt before, there was none now. The divide in the country had never been clearer. There were those who saw Jack Reynolds as a hero. And those who saw Elon Musk as the future. But the military had made its choice. And the fight was only beginning. Elon Musk had never been one to back down. He had built his empire on defiance, on challenging the establishment and bending the rules to his will. This was no different. To him, the outrage was predictable, a script he had seen play out before. The key was to control the narrative, to shift the conversation away from the meaning of his actions and onto the reaction they provoked. Within hours, his response came, not through a formal statement, not through any act of clarification, but through X. The post was brief, laced with the same arrogance that had fueled his rise. Jack Reynolds, the soldier who had dared to stand against him, was dismissed as a pawn of an outdated institution. The military, Musk declared, was obsolete. AI, automation, and private enterprise would soon render men like Reynolds irrelevant. His words carried weight. Musk was no mere provocateur, he was a man with contracts woven deep into the fabric of the U.S. defense industry. The satellites guiding the military's operations. Starlink. The rockets carrying classified payloads into orbit. SpaceX. The AI driving the future of autonomous warfare. Tesla's neural networks. He did not need the approval of generals. He believed they needed him. But this time, he had miscalculated. Jack's response was not crafted in a boardroom. He had no advisors, no PR team to spin his words. When the media reached out, he answered. The networks lined up, eager for the soldier at the center of the storm to speak. And when the cameras turned to him, his message was simple. Musk could build rockets. He could build machines. But he could not build courage. That line, spoken with quiet resolve, ripped through the country like wildfire. It was not just a rebuttal, it was a challenge. Musk's empire had been built on the backs of engineers, scientists, and dreamers. But Jack's words reminded people that no machine had ever fought and died for the flag Musk's companies now profited from. The Pentagon had been watching. And now, it acted. The military was no stranger to controversy. It had weathered scandals, political storms, and public scrutiny before. But this was different. This was a direct insult. The highest-ranking officials in the Department of Defense gathered behind closed doors. This was not just about optics. This was about security, about control, about who truly held the reins of power in America. They had ignored Musk's eccentricities before. His provocations, his unpredictable behavior, his thinly veiled disdain for authority, it had all been tolerated because his technology was invaluable. His rockets had revolutionized space travel. His AI research had pushed the limits of modern warfare. His satellite network had become the backbone of military communications. But now, the calculus had changed. For the first time, every contract tied to Musk's empire came under review. The fallout was immediate. Investors panicked. The defense sector, long intertwined with Musk's ventures, suddenly found itself on unstable ground. If SpaceX lost military contracts, if Starlink was no longer the Pentagon's preferred network, if Tesla's AI research was severed from defense projects, billions of dollars were at stake. And then came the voices. Veterans groups, long silent on matters of private industry, spoke out. This was not about politics. It was about dignity, about service, about the idea that no soldier, past or present, would be disrespected by a man who had never worn the uniform. Active duty soldiers, bound by regulation, could not openly engage. But they found ways to make their voices heard. A quiet boycott of Tesla vehicles on bases. A refusal to use Starlink terminals where alternatives were available. A subtle but undeniable shift away from Musk's technology. Even inside Musk's own companies, there was unrest. Engineers who had signed on to build a better future suddenly found themselves questioning whose future they were really building. A leaked memo from inside SpaceX revealed unease, employees grappling with the implications of their CEO's actions. Some resigned. Others protested. The world was watching. And Musk, for all his power, had lost control of the narrative. The cracks in Elon Musk's empire widened into fractures. The Department of Defense, once reliant on his rockets and networks, began pulling away, contract by contract, deal by deal. The shift was calculated, methodical, an unmistakable message that the military no longer trusted him. At first, the announcements were quiet. A classified contract for satellite communications, once destined for Starlink, was rerouted to a competitor. A SpaceX launch, scheduled to carry a critical defense payload, was delayed indefinitely as the Air Force explored alternative providers. These were not symbolic gestures. They were economic weapons, cutting into the lifeblood of Musk's empire. The markets took notice. Tesla, SpaceX, and Starlink, pillars of Musk's dominance, began to bleed. Defense contracts had propped up these ventures for years, providing steady revenue and federal backing. But as those contracts evaporated, investors panicked. Share prices wavered, then collapsed in freefall. Wall Street analysts issued warnings. For the first time, Musk was no longer seen as untouchable. His companies, once synonymous with the future, were now burdened by uncertainty. Corporate partners distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught in the fallout. Inside Tesla headquarters, murmurs of discontent grew louder. Senior executives, watching their stock options lose value by the hour, began questioning whether Musk was still an asset or a liability. There was no hiding from the consequences of his arrogance. But the world's attention had already moved elsewhere. Jack Reynolds had become a symbol. The image of him standing firm at the inauguration, his uniform crisp, his eyes locked onto Musk in defiance, had been shared across every corner of the internet. It was on magazine covers, in newspaper op-eds, on billboards erected by veteran organizations. The moment had outgrown him. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a statement. And then came the invitation. West Point. The United States Military Academy, where future officers were forged, where history was both studied and made. The institution had weathered centuries of war, political upheaval, and shifting tides of power. And now, they wanted to hear from Jack. The auditorium was packed. Cadets in pristine dress uniforms sat at attention, waiting for the man who had reminded the country what duty looked like. The podium, adorned with the Academy's insignia, stood as a reminder that the weight of history was never far from the present. Jack stepped forward. The cameras rolled. And the nation listened. History did not return in black and white footage, he reminded them. It did not announce itself with fanfare or warning. It happened in moments like these, in small tests of courage, in quiet decisions to stand or remain silent. And he would not stay silent. The words cut through the noise of the moment, carrying a truth that could not be ignored. The room, filled with the next generation of military leaders, erupted into a standing ovation. But while Jack's voice carried weight, it was the Pentagon's next move that delivered the final blow. There would be no partial severance. No warnings. No room for negotiation. In an official statement, the Department of Defense announced the full termination of all remaining contracts with Musk's companies. Effective immediately. The words were cold, absolute. The military, the institution Musk had mocked as outdated, had declared him obsolete. It was over. The unraveling of Elon Musk's empire was swift and merciless. The moment the Pentagon severed ties, the illusion of his invincibility shattered. Without military contracts, SpaceX's dominance in defense aerospace crumbled. The company, once the unrivaled leader in government spaceflight, was suddenly outmatched by rising competitors. The Air Force and NASA redirected their funding to alternative providers, companies that had once operated in Musk's shadow. The lucrative military payloads that had fueled SpaceX's expansion were gone, and with them, the stability of the entire enterprise. The financial blow rippled outward. Tesla, already struggling under the weight of public scrutiny, entered freefall. Investors, once willing to tolerate Musk's unpredictability, now saw him as a liability. Shareholders, battered by plunging stock prices and unrelenting media firestorms, demanded action. It came in the form of a forced resignation. The boardrooms of Tesla and SpaceX had long been dominated by Musk's presence, but now, behind closed doors, the same executives who once lauded his genius moved to remove him. There were no dramatic speeches, no last-minute salvations, just a quiet, clinical decision. He was out. His departure was announced without fanfare, a curt statement citing a strategic restructuring to restore investor confidence. The world had watched him rise. Now, it watched him fall. Jack Reynolds saw none of it unfold in real time. In the weeks following his speech at West Point, offers flooded in. Media networks sought exclusive interviews, publishers dangled lucrative book deals, political figures hinted at endorsements. The machinery of influence, eager to mold him into a national figure, closed in around him. He rejected them all. Fame was never his mission. The cameras, the book tours, the staged appearances, they held no appeal. While the world debated his legacy, Jack made his decision. He returned to active duty. It was a quiet transition, unannounced, unceremonious. The country had already turned its attention to the next scandal, the next controversy. But Jack had never acted for attention. His duty had not ended. The cemetery was quiet. The rows of white headstones stretched in perfect symmetry, standing against the endless expanse of green. Jack moved with reverence, the familiar weight of his uniform grounding him as he walked between the graves. The air carried the distant echo of footsteps, the occasional rustling of the flag atop its pole. He stopped before one particular headstone, its inscription worn but unwavering. His grandfather's name. A man who had fought against the same darkness that had threatened to creep back into the world. A man who had stood when it mattered. Jack straightened his posture, lifted his hand, and saluted. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words carried through the stillness. He had done his part. Just like his grandfather had. The war never really ends. But as long as men like Jack Reynolds stand, neither does the fight for what's right.